Hello, and welcome to Charmed Life, the podcast and YouTube channel about magic, metaphysics, mysticism, and the unconditional love of the universe. I am your host, Tricia Carr. I am a spiritual teacher. I am also a multidimensional channel and medium, animal telepath, and hypnotherapist. And I'm very excited about this episode. And if you listen to me regularly, I know I say that every time, but this one was really so much fun for me because my very special guest and I have so much that we have in common for interest so far as Western mysticism is concerned and also just magic. And so my guest is Damien Echols. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Life After Death, co-author of Yours for Eternity. He co-authored that with his wife, Lori Davis. And also in 2018, he published High Magick, a guide to the spiritual practices that saved my life on death row. I read High Magick, and I am in the process of reading his brand new book, just published this week, Angels and Archangels, A Magician's Guide. I'm not going to convince you about buying that book or checking out these books because I think you're going to really just love it as you listen to all that Damien and I get to talk about in this episode. Very excited to welcome to Charmed Life, Damien Echols. Damien's story is fascinating, and there are documentaries and books and everything. And his second book, I think it is, High Magick, he talks a little bit about his background. And so I encourage you after this interview, if you're interested in learning a little more about his background, go and check that out. We're going to start with his work right now, which is so powerful, and it is with magic. So welcome, Damien. So glad to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you have also started a YouTube channel, which I'm enjoying very much. And so I encourage folks to go and check that out. What I love about your work, both in the writing and in all of the presentation that you're doing, is it's very practical. It's very comprehensive and holistic. Mm-hmm. And as I told you earlier when we were just greeting one another, so authentic. So I guess let's go ahead and imagine people haven't read High Magick, and your next book is coming out really soon, Angels and Archangels, A Magician's Guide. Mm-hmm. So tell folks what is your dedication or your work in magic, or maybe even start with what magic is.
My tradition, my practice is what we call High Magick, which, that's kind of a slang for it. The actual technical term for High Magick is astrotheurgy. Mm-hmm. And what it involves is invoking the intelligences that are inherent in star systems, constellations, that in modern day times we call them angels, but they've had, they've been called other things all the way, back to the dawn of human civilization. For me personally, whenever I delved, whenever we talk about magic is spelled with a K, M-A-G-I-C-K. The K is added to the end. Most people now, in spiritual traditions at least, are familiar with the concept that when you see the K at the end, that was sort of added to so that whenever you see the word, you can differentiate it from sleight of hand, stage magic, pulling rabbits out of hats or sawing someone in half, things like that, which is part of the reason it has the K. But the K was actually added by a magician that belonged to the Order of the Golden Dawn. His name was Aleister Crowley. And the reason he added the K was also so that whenever you saw that, you would know automatically that you were talking about an ancient Sumerian tradition of spiritual development.
Well, we can't pass by Aleister Crowley that easily. He is a very interesting character. So I am studying right now the Law of One, the raw material, and they actually asked Ra about Aleister Crowley in that work, and the way that Ra described it, and sorry I'm passing real fast through these concepts because I don't want to derail our conversation, was just basically that Aleister had some of the real stuff going and then kind of just got a little bit derailed by some ego and some other darkness and whatnot. What do you think about some of what is reported that he got up to with having, I heard something about as a young man or a young boy sex slave in his closet and all this kind of crazy stuff. What is your take on all of that?
Most of that kind of stuff, whenever you actually start to do the research into it, you find that there's almost no truth to hardly any of it.
Interesting.
It's mostly written by people who did not have any understanding or concept of what he was even talking about. You know, whenever you cannot just read his writing, his books. Very few things. He produced very few things which are surface level reading material. Most of it is sort of like, I hesitate to use the word code, but that's sort of what it is. You have to have passed certain benchmarks within magic to even be able to understand what you're reading. Right. You know, and you could go into things, for example, like you'll hear a lot of accusations that he was into human sacrifice, and they'll point to specific things in his writing to bring that up. What they don't comprehend or what they don't understand is if you don't have a background in things like Western ceremonial magic or Eastern Tantra and all sorts of other things, you don't even realize that keep in mind that at the time he's writing this stuff, it is illegal to write about sex in England. He could have been thrown in prison for it. He is writing about Tantra. When he uses phrases like sacrifice, he is talking about an orgasm that is done as a ritual act for the purpose of expansion of consciousness versus procreation.
Right.
I think it is really, really hard to find things that are written by people that are connected to his lineage or tradition that have a very strong, deep understanding of what he's even talking about. For people who want to really know, who really want to explore this subject, and keep in mind, this is not like a light, breezy, read a book and suddenly you understand type thing. This is a lifelong commitment to study. I would suggest the order that he began after he left the Golden Dawn, which was, it's usually called the AA, but a lot of people, whenever they hear AA, will automatically think of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's not the same AA. The AA that Crowley started was called Astrum Argentium, which means the Order of the Silver Star. So anybody who really wants to delve into what this work really means, that's where I usually suggest that they would start at.
So it sounds to me like they tried to cancel Aleister Crowley, the cancel culture that we have now.
Yes. But, at the same time, he did bring a lot of that sort of stuff on himself.
Sure.
In his own behavior, and in the way he didn't back down from anyone. If people challenged him, he would usually antagonize them and make the situation worse because, and part of that also ties into the fact that he was trying to get magic out to a mainstream or a wider audience. Keep in mind, magic is a tradition that up until very, very recently was not something that the masses had access to. When you're going magic, the Crowley tradition of magic is very, very tied into things like, for example, the history of the Bible, which most people don't know. But when you're talking about, for example, the Old Testament of the Bible, you're talking about a book that is written for kings, by kings, about kings. It was never meant to be read and understood by the common person. This was something that you were only going to be able to understand what you were even reading in one of two ways. One is if you were born into royalty or aristocracy, which back in those days were, most people couldn't even read. The only way you were going to be able to read and write is if you were born into one of those royal aristocratic families, or if you were part of a tradition that passed down sort of this key that allowed you to decipher what this information was about. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Like when I said that magic is about astrotheurgy, magic basically gave birth to every religion in the Western world. What astrotheurgy is the study and practice of developing and changing our consciousness with celestial energies and intelligences. When you're looking at, like in the Bible, for example, when you're talking about things like Jesus and the 12 disciples, you're talking about the sun and the 12 constellations of the zodiac. A lot of the stuff in the Bible that most people don't think makes sense, like say a man being born of a virgin, it's because we usually don't have the key to understand that. For example, you're talking about the constellation of Virgo. You're not talking about a woman who's never been married or never had sex or whatever it is. So you go from the Old Testament, where very, very few people, like basically now what we would call the 1%, had access to this information. That's why magic was called the science of kings, or the royal science. It is the science of becoming a king. So that's what the entire New Testament was about. When Jesus comes along, the point of his work is to take this incredibly powerful tool, and take it out of the hands of this very elite strata of society and bring it to the masses. That's what the work of Jesus was about. Crowley was in a lot of ways trying to do the exact same thing. He was trying to take magic out of this rarefied environment and give it to anyone who wanted to take a crack at it. He said magic is for the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. Basically, anybody who has the intelligence or desire to practice this should be able to try it, to do it.
And the symbolism, as you're talking about, or written in code, and thinking about how you can't really, there are layers. There's a sustainable path, a natural path, growth, pattern that we all have to kind of develop in. And so even just the example that you gave, that people couldn't even read. So there was a lot of personal development or inner work that wouldn't even be able to grasp it. Now, that's definitely not where we are now, because collectively we are at obviously people, for the most part, fortunately, and there's a lot of misfortune about that, can read and have access, and collectively our vibration is higher. But by the way, I have a little mini series within my podcast called Metaphysics of the Bible. So I love to dig in and talk about the symbolism. But what just occurred to me was, Jesus is the Lord, or Yeshua is the Lord of the Piscean age, and the Christianity and Jesus, the fish symbology and everything, all about, I hadn't really thought of that before. So,
you just went into a very, very deep aspect of magic. It's actually one of the aspects of magic that I love and could get lost in for days at a time. People don't realize that not only is Christianity symbolic of the age of Pisces, all other religions are also products of the age that they come from. When you're talking about going back to ancient Sumeria, where magic began, I used to do these tours at the Met where I would take people through like the Near Eastern section and give them the history of magic, how magic develops. And one thing that you see in all of these old Sumerian statues is you'll see these gods and these goddesses and these mythical creatures that all have these bull horns on their head. They were in crowns made of horns. And at first I would think, well, why bull horns? That seems like a really pedestrian thing for a king or a god or a queen or whoever to be wearing. So when you start doing research into it, one of the very few things that you'll find about it is those bullhorns represented kingship or divinity. And you think, well, that's okay, that's fine, but why did it represent those things? It's because at the time that ancient Sumeria, you're talking about the religion of polytheism, many gods, many goddesses. At the time that is the dominant feature of the religion of the world, what the Sumerians knew, they understood very, very precisely events that were going on in the heavens. For example, the equinoxes. What we now know is the precession of the equinoxes. What this means, and this is why all different cultures have paid so much attention to the spring equinox. If you stand facing east at the spring equinox for between 2,100 and 2,500 years, you will see the sun rise in the same constellation of the zodiac. If you were to stand facing east in ancient Sumeria on the spring equinox, you would have seen the sun rise in the sign of Taurus for over 2,000 years, which is where the bullhorns come from.
Right.
Skip ahead about 2,150 years, if you would have stood, and keep in mind, then this would have been the age when Judaism was the religion that was starting to spread throughout Western culture. It was the big growing spiritual path. If you stood facing east at this time and watched the sunrise at the spring equinox, you would have seen the sunrise in the sign of Aries. This is why in Judaism, there's all these symbols like, the Jewish priests play the ram's horn. Yeah. It's why when Abraham's getting ready to sacrifice Isaac, God sends a ram to him instead. Yes. It's why when Moses comes down off of the mountain, he freaks out when he sees people worshiping the golden calf.
Because it's outdated. Yes, that was Taurus. Y'all were here in Aries. Yes. And the burning bush as well, the fire symbology.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then whenever you skip ahead 2,150 years later, you stand facing east at the time of the spring equinox and you see the sunrise in the sign of Pisces. Mm. This is why, there's all this fish symbolism in Christianity, like Jesus called his disciples fishers of men. Mm-hmm. Whenever he feeds the multitudes, he feeds them with 2 fish. Even in the earliest churches that they're starting to excavate in the world now, they have found that there were no crosses in these churches. Instead, the symbol that they found in all the tile work and everywhere else was a symbol of 2 fish laying end to end. Mm-hmm. At one point, Jesus even tells the disciples, he says, I'm getting ready to leave you. They say, well, what do we do when you leave? He says, follow the man with the water pitcher into his house. Well, men did not carry water pitchers in those days. That was considered entirely women's work. However, the sign of Aquarius, which is what the sun would be going into next, is symbolized by a bearded man holding a water pitcher. Wow. All of these religions are about the stars.
Whew. I'm exploding. It's so good. Such good stuff. Well, you know what else this reminds me of the ages, the ruling ages, is the statue in Daniel 8. I get fidgety when I read it. The statue in Daniel 8 is really talking about all the different ages, ending at the feet with the 10 toes, which are like the splintering. So that's... wow, good stuff.
The ages, and it also symbolizes, keep in mind that a lot of these stories have what they call front speech and back speech.
Yes.
Front speech is like the part of the story given to the masses. Mm-hmm. Back speech is the part of the story that is usually reserved only for initiates. One of the things that Jesus was trying to do away with, Crowley was trying to do away with, and it's part of what modern magicians are supposed to be doing as well. Once you reach a certain place in your spiritual development, it's sort of looked at as like your obligation to preserve these teachings so that people can find them in the future, so that they're not just restricted to a very small percentage. But when you're talking about the statue in Daniel, and this is one of the things also, I always point out, Daniel is probably my favorite book of the Bible. Yeah. I have a framed picture of Daniel hanging above my bed. Most people will try to tell you that Christianity or that magic is anti-Christian, or that, it's the opposite of Christianity. If you read the book of Daniel, right there, it tells you as plain as day, it calls Daniel not only a magician, it says he is the master of magicians. And it says the way he becomes that is because when he is a child, the king Nebuchadnezzar has him sent to be trained by the Chaldeans, which is what they call the Sumerians, these priests who studied the stars. So he sends Daniel and all these other young boys to study under these Sumerian astrologers and magicians. Whenever he starts to have a dream at one point, he wakes up the next day and he doesn't even remember what this dream is. All he knows is it was incredibly unsettling. So he calls Daniel and all of these other magicians, his official court magicians, to him. And he says, not only do you have to tell me what my dream meant, you have to tell me what I dreamed. It says that Daniel can tell him what he dreamed because God sends Daniel the exact same dream. So in this dream, Daniel says, you dreamed of a statue that has a golden head, a silver chest and arms, a bronze belly and thighs, iron calves, and feet made of iron and clay. So on the outside, what this represents is, like you said, the ages of the world. Like he tells Nebuchadnezzar, you are the golden head of the statue. Babylon is the most valuable, perfected, sought after part of this statue. God has given you this kingdom. Everything that comes after you will be watered down, will be slightly less valuable. And it will keep going that way until this cycle starts over again. So you're talking about, you go from Babylon, which is the head, to Persia, which is the silver chest and arms, which is also just a crazy, amazing story, going into the Persian stuff and how that ties into the book of Esther. The book of Esther, it's the only book or it's one of the few books of the Bible that God has never even mentioned. Yeah. And the word Esther is Persian for star. It's a reference to the ancient Sumerian goddess Inanna. or what most people here, call her now Ishtar. That's entirely what that book of the Bible was about, Esther. But you go from, Persia being the silver chest and arms to, from there, magic spreads to ancient Greece. Alexander the Great comes in, conquered, the Greeks conquer Persia. The current of magic spreads into Greece, where it, that's the bronze belly and thigh. So it's a little less valuable. It's a little more watered down, a little less coherent than the previous eon. From Greece, you go into the ancient Roman Empire, which is where the current of magic spreads to next. That's the iron calves and feet. The iron calves. Then you go into the modern day world, which is the iron and clay feet. What the iron and clay feet represents is, it's the weakest, least valuable part of the statue. And a huge part of that is because so much of the information that these previous aeons and civilizations had about magic, we have now lost. We don't have access to those things anymore.
And even the toes they're 10, almost like 10 separate kingdoms, 10 separate and weakened kingdoms within the one kingdom of the Roman Empire. After the Roman Empire collapsed, it broke apart into 10 smaller kingdoms. Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm so excited. I'm like saying it with you.
That's the same way I always feel whenever I start going into this stuff.
Oh my gosh, that's so fascinating. It's so crazy how, just how it works. I mentioned Daniel, like I'm all about Daniel 8 in this.
One thing also, if you notice on the cover of Angels and Archangels, the figure that's on there also ties into the Bible. It's a Lamassu. It's what they called it in ancient Sumer. This was the very first depiction of an archangel in the world.
Oh, cool.
A Lamassu is what they called a tetramorph. A tetramorph is a figure that is made by combining 4 figures together. So when you're looking at the Lamassu, you're looking at something that is it's a combination of a lion, a bull, a man, and an eagle. And you'll find those 4 symbols repeated over and over throughout Christianity. Even the books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they say are represented by those 4 things. In all of Christian artwork up until the Renaissance, you'll see those 4 things. Keep in mind that in these ancient times, art was not what it is now. Back then, art was seen, they knew a time would come when their written language was no longer readable, when no one spoke their language anymore. But if you could decipher this iconography, you could still get to the techniques and information within these things. Somewhere, so that continued all the way up until the Renaissance. That's why when you look at Christian paintings in the Renaissance, you'll see the lion, the bull, the man, and the eagle, sometimes pictured in the 4 corners where Jesus is. After the Renaissance, art became more like cultural cannibalism, more like political commentary, or people expressing their feelings or
the internet. Basically, it became the internet.
Yes. But that Lamassu, you will see these creatures talked about in both the Old and New Testament. In the Old Testament, you find them in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel says he sees these 4 creatures pulling a throne or pulling a chariot to the throne of God, which became like the source of the Jewish esoteric magic practices, the Merkaba. The chariot that they're pulling to the throne of God is your aura. You're transforming your aura, your entire energy system, by invoking and consuming these 4 energies. What these 4 energies represent: the lion is Leo, the bull is Taurus, the man is Aquarius, and the eagle, most people when they think of Scorpio think of a scorpion, but also the eagle and the phoenix are symbols of Scorpio. So you are looking at the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac combined into one animal. So Ezekiel sees them. You see them mentioned again thousands of years later by John in the book of Revelation, where John says he sees these 4 creatures standing before the throne of God and weeping, saying, who can read the scrolls? No one can be found who can open the scrolls. What that means is we will, and kind of have, entered a time in history where nobody even remembers this information anymore. It's been forgotten.
But for you and other people who are doing the work or carrying it on.
Carrying it
forward. Bringing down some of that gold all the way down to the toes. Well, you know what? I have to say, I prepared this question in advance, and I didn't have to because we're already talking about it, because I wanted to talk about whether initiation is necessary, and when we say initiation, I see that as just personal and spiritual development. before we start to practice magic, or, maybe that is such as crossing the abyss, which you can talk to us about. You talk about that in the Angels and Archangels. And is it more advisable to have that kind of initiation, which is maybe more of a personal process, or is magic only as effective as whatever that personal process is? And so it's not going to engage with the cosmic energies by the laws of how energy works, right? I don't know. What do you think?
Kind of, I really think it's a little bit of both. Yeah. So it's a little bit of all of that, just because a lot of these things, one of the reasons for initiation is sort of like you are having information passed to you from a lineage of people who have preserved this, sometimes all the way back to the dawn of human civilization. They have these keys to decipher this information. They have techniques that you're not going to find, in books or websites and things that are, just everywhere. So there is incredibly valuable things that you can obtain from a legitimate initiation into a magical lineage, but is it absolutely needed? I don't think it is at all. No, absolutely not. I think if you do the work, if you study the material, you will find whatever it is you need to find to fill in those gaps that you're missing.
Well, and the thing is, if you study the material, that is basically like an initiation process. It's someone else collected it. Some other master or decoder collected it together. And also, if you spend enough time in the material, then you will start connecting. You will be able to decode it yourself. Basically, you'll be connecting to the energy beneath it. Absolutely. Like you were saying, things are written in code, like the Bible's written in code. But I studied the Bible from the time I was 11. I got into underneath the code and started saying, wait, this church stuff doesn't make any sense to the thing that they say they are going by, at least.
Yes. That is absolutely true. What I'm referring to, I guess, about the things given to you, for me, for example, were things that I didn't find information on in other places. Like, for example, when you're talking about the 72 angels of the Shemha Mepharash, or what they call in magic, the Shem operation, just because it's such a mouthful to say that, and how that ties into things like, for example, you find the number 72 repeated over and over throughout, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, they say that Jesus has 72 disciples. Or in the book of Abramelin the Mage, which is one of the big, most influential books in magic, that is, it's basically the process of how to come in contact or how to attain the knowledge and conversation of the HGA, what they call the Holy Guardian Angel. It says in there that Abramelin at one point goes to give money to 72 poor people. You come across this number 72, and I it wouldn't have registered just because I had never seen anything explaining to me what is the significance of this 72. The only way that I found out about that was by coming in contact with, I was fortunate enough to come in contact with an order of practicing magicians and alchemists based in Europe who had ties to this material was a very deep foundational part of their practice. And it was like they gave me things that all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, why didn't I see that before? Or suddenly all this other stuff started falling into place that I never would have, I won't say I never would have been able to figure it out on my own, but they perhaps saved me 10 to 20 years of floundering around and struggling by giving me things that brought all of this stuff into perspective.
I love that, I fell in love with numerology again by studying the Bible when I was a kid, because when I was a kid, that was the only paradigm that I knew for spiritual development. I grew up in Texas, and my family didn't take me to church. I took myself to church. And so that was my paradigm. That was the way I knew to develop spiritually. But I love the numerology in the Bible, or numerology in all of the different sacred texts and traditions and rituals. And the 72 to me right off the bat, 7 is the number of spirituality, both inner and outer. 2 is the number of love. And then together they come to 9, which is about the harvest, which is the full maturity and humanitarianism and unity. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. I would love to. Yeah, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that usually 72, what we're doing with it in magic, you know, like I said, all of this goes back to the stars. It's all based on the study of the stars. So, you know, we have the 12 constellations of the zodiac, and there is an archangel, which is the intelligence behind all 12 of those constellations. Well, if you take a constellation of the zodiac, it can be split into 3 equal parts of 10 degrees. So each of those 10 degrees also has an intelligence that presides over it. So now you have the 12 constellations of the zodiac with their 12 intelligences. And if you split each one into 3 equal parts of 10 degrees, you have 36 more. So these 36 are the angels of the deacons. Well, if you take those 10 degrees and split them in half, you have 72, which are, you know, further divisions of every constellation of the zodiac. And these 72 portions of the zodiac also have intelligences that preside over them. So when you're going through these invocation rituals and you're invoking all of these intelligences around you, you're doing several things simultaneously. You know, you're interacting with this energy, you're absorbing it, but you are also on a very deep level triggering something in your psyche, because if you have just invoked every constellation and every deacon of the constellations and every, you know, split them down into 72 portions, all around you, what you have just said to your consciousness is, I am the center of the universe. Yes. And you're invoking really the consciousness that is, you know, your own consciousness that is those parts as well. Yes. And so that's why invocation, we just talked about this yesterday in the class that I taught. Invocation is so powerful. What the way they described it to me yesterday, I mean, like archangels are my guides, because I partially channel class. Some of those classes I prepare a little bit, but I channel a lot of it so I can learn as well. And what they were saying about invoking archangels or invoking some kind of cosmic master or egregore, as I want to talk about in a sec, then you are you're invoking that of yourself. You're creating the frequency that is true about you, and they meet you the rest of the way, because they are also real, and they meet you the rest of the way, and grace takes care of the rest. And and so what they were talking about yesterday, I want to share with you, was because we have this human concept of doubt, and particularly people who are interested, who are kind of studying some of the law of attraction and everything, and we think that, oh, if I have doubts, it's not going to work. And that's, I'm sure this is definitely a part of magic too. The way they explained it to me yesterday was just having doubts is just your intelligent energy recognizing other probable, possible, and, you know, parallel realities, but they don't run you, you run them. And so you just choose not to run that program, basically, and that's fine. Absolutely. And I've found that, you know, there are things, it's like when you're interacting with these intelligences that we're calling angels and archangels, they are, for some reason, I have found them to be more effective than any other kind of magic that I ever tried previous to that. You know, it's like you automatically start seeing changes in yourself, in your environment. And it's like, if you do use it for like some sort of manifestation purposes, it seems like it comes about so much more quickly and harmoniously and more powerful than anything that I tried before that. But, you know, going back to what you were saying a second ago about the thing inside yourself, it's like the way we look at it in magic is, you're working with them on 2 different levels simultaneously. Yes, there is the external, you know, yes, these things have existed long before we were born, but at the, and you are working with them on that level of reality, you know, as an independent, separate individual consciousness from your own. But at the same time, there are parts of your own psyche and soul that correspond to those outer intelligences. So you're kind of working on them outwardly and, like you said, inwardly in yourself at the exact same time. And for me, you know, you're talking about doubt and things like that. For me, it was like I would go back and forth between those things in the beginning, and I would think, you know, am I really doing something external, or is this all internal? And I would go back and forth. I would think, okay, it's all internal. You know, this happened, so it's all internal. And then, you know, weeks go by and I would say, no, that happened. And there's no way, if this was just all internal, that it would have had some sort of external materialization or manifestation aspect like that. Eventually what I came to realize is, oh, they don't contradict each other. It's happening at the same time. And my point to all that is I found that even if I did have doubt, even if I didn't know exactly what I was doing, if I kept at it, these things, if you take a step towards them, they will take 10 towards you. So you can have doubt and it will still work.
Yes, that's like the grace. Like they will rush in. And yesterday they kind of put it in a percentage and they're like, don't hold too stringently to these percentages. But let's say in order for healing, manifestation, whatever it is, whatever outcome you are endeavoring to see with your magic or your invocation, that if you have 51% of running the frequency, you could have 49% of what we think is doubt, and it can work. Yesterday they said on average it's usually 70%, and that's just because you have the doubt or the programs that you would be running that we call doubt, because you're learning from them still. And that's why it tends to be an average of 70%, but they still rush in the rest of that 30% for us,
I would say, and for me, I think that was probably, not only did I have probably that degree of maybe even more than 70% in the beginning, like when I first started doing these practices, not only did I doubt it, but I also had, I guess the only way to describe it is almost like an axe to grind, because I was on death row at the time that I started doing some of these practices. And I was put there by people who did not understand anything that I was talking about when I was talking about magic. So I'm accused of being a Satanist. These people tried to murder me. They sent me to death row. So the way I'm looking at it is this is the spiritual paradigm of the people who are trying to murder me. I don't want anything to do with that. So not only did I have the doubt, I had like this kind of vehement, no, thank you sort of stance. But when I actually forced myself, it's like, what do you got to lose? So I started doing them. And when I saw how effective they were, the doubt started to, that rate of doubt started to drop like crazy, until over the years, I think I reached a point where, I would probably be more surprised if something didn't work than if it did.
Right.
You reach you can have a ton of doubt in the beginning. And this is one of the reasons, when you're talking about manifestation, I think it can come off sometimes sounding kind of shallow. Like people think, oh, that's the extent of your spiritual practice, is trying to manifest something in the world. That's not very deep. It's not very holy. It's not very sacred. One of the ways that I look at it is if you show someone this and they're able to use it to manifest something, you have just probably increased their faith tremendously. They're like, oh my God, it worked to do that. So what else will it work to do? It's like the more success you have, the more your level of doubt starts to drop, or at least that's how it was for me personally. Yeah,
it's like humans well, there's power in the paradox. That's what you're getting at, this universe is a paradox, because there's the creator, or the source of all things, which if it's the source of all things, it's also nothing. So in order for it to experience anything, it had to have a thought or a word or a movement, and that's what we are. And yet we're all one, you know what I mean? Like law, that's, it's there's power in the paradox. But if you go down to the atoms have, positive charge, negative charge, and a neutral charge. And the neutral charge is that masterful position. So with the doubt, kind of concern, it does seem to go away, because humans are about a journey. And for me, with reading, with intuitive reading, and I do animal telepathy and all of that, that's one model. Or even just teaching, where before I go up, I might be like resistant, doubtful, all this human stuff. Like, who says, what crazy person says they can talk to a dead animal? You know what I mean? Like, that's insane. I'll have that little voice. But then the experience of all the times, of every single time it just happens, talks me into it. I mean, I can talk my ego into it to just shut up and, get on board. And it's that experience that just becomes the evidence that makes it helps you to just set the container for yourself.
And I do kind of the same thing you were talking about a while ago, about like you don't completely prepare for whatever you're going to teach, because you want to leave room for, that influx, that energy to speak through you. But what I would say, I probably prepare for whatever class or audio program or whatever it is I'm going to do. I probably prepare maybe 10%. What I usually do for the rest is I will start doing invocations sometimes several days beforehand for angels and archangels that are associated with the planetary energy of Mercury, because Mercury is always about, conveying ideas and expressing information in a way that other people can understand, things like that. I will start doing invocations of angels of Mercury saying, help me.
Yeah.
Let me do whatever needs to be done. 9 times, if I do that, not only 9 times out of 10, I walk in and it's like just blah, like all this stuff just comes out of me. Yeah. But it's also like at the end of it, I'm like, where in the hell did that come from? That was amazing. So
and like it's cohesive. Said, weirdly, it's cohesive. That actually makes sense. And you're like, oh, yes. Okay.
And it's like you do learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've noticed I've played around with it and I've done like extensive outlines for teaching. But then when I'm actually going to do it, I'll not look down at the outline because it's going, like you say. And then I look down and I scan and it's like, oh, we did that. Oh, we actually went beyond that. And so it almost is like falling.
Yeah, it's the same thing. And, for me too, it's like, I don't like teaching. I like learning.
Oh, okay.
So whenever I
was like, come on, man.
It's like I kind of get the best of both worlds.
Right.
Yes, you are teaching something, but at the same time, it's like, for me at least, I'm learning at least, 50% of whatever I'm teaching. I'm learning it at the same time. So it's kind of an amazing experience. When you experience that, it hooks you with working with angels and archangels. It makes you want more and more and more of it.
All right. So I have a couple of things I want to talk about as it concerns angels and archangels. And so first of all, actually, I don't think we said this on the podcast. We were just talking about how the archangel energies or the angelic energies are like the Western path to enlightenment, which is what you talk about in the book, Angels and Archangels. And just to, mentioning that the other, like on the East, they have the Hindu pantheon of gods and goddesses, and it's an organization of basically code that they use to connect with somehow to those same energies. And so, and that's always been important for me in my teaching. While I favor the Western path because that's how I came up, I also felt constrained by the religion that is associated with it. So I always got to kind of stay awake in it. You know what I mean? And so you talked recently about egregores, which I found so helpful because I teach about thought forms, but there's the individuation of having your own personal energy of thought form and then the egregore energy.
Yes.
Talk about that, man.
Okay. So, probably
I love having a word for
your
it.
listeners are going to be familiar with thought forms. A thought form is basically like whatever shape you put it in, whether you put it into the shape of an angel or even just a sphere, like a glowing ball of energy that you sort of program for a specific purpose and then release it. You putting energy into something for a specific purpose and then let it go to do its job. There's names. You can say you're doing all sorts of things. You can say, you're doing energy work or you're doing meditation or you're doing magic. But essentially what you're doing is creating what in magic we call a thought form, which is like a pocket of energy that's been programmed to do something. A egregore, on the other hand, is like a thought form created by more than one person. Like Jesus says, where 2 or more come together in my name, there I will be in their midst.
Right.
So an egregore can be made of 2 people's energy, or it can be made through entire culture's energy. So this is the difference between like working with the Eastern traditions and the Western traditions is when you work, one of the reasons that we work with the Western traditions is because it forges contacts with the Western egregores. So one of the things we're trying to do in ceremonial magic is, you have different benchmarks. In magic, you have the levels of training that you pass through. You have the first order, the second order, and the third order. The first order is where you are taught all of the basic rituals, like the pentagram rituals, the hexagram rituals, the middle pillar, the rose cross, all of these sorts of things. The second order is where you take these rituals and start using them in a practical way. Now, by practical, it could mean anything from manifesting something, bettering your life situation, to doing it for spiritual sustenance. What I mean by spiritual sustenance is in magic, we say the point of this practice, what we are reaching towards is completion of the great work. So you start doing magic saying, let me complete the great work within this lifetime. essentially is what you're doing. Well, in the second order, once you start doing this work, like the pinnacle of the second order is what we call attaining the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Keep in mind, this does not mean what most people think it means when they hear phrases like holy guardian angel, because you are trying to read something that was written in code. This was written by orders that if you were given this stuff, you were also going to be given other information along with it by the people that you're being initiated by. What attaining the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel is you will forge a connection to the egregore that is behind all of the Abrahamic religions in the West. What Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all refer to as God. You are forming a very, very, it's kind of difficult to even describe to people how once this happens, the way your consciousness will change. The only word that I can think of to describe what happens as you begin downloading, you will start to see everything in the world in an entirely different way. You're sort of seeing it halfway through your eyes and halfway through the eyes of what we would think of as God. When you pass into the third order, to pass into the third order, you have to go through a process they call crossing the abyss. This is the reason that you're trying to connect with this egregore that we call the HGA. You take the energy that is flooding through you from that, and that's what you use to cross the abyss. Crossing the abyss is the dissolution of the self, where you experience firsthand that you are the infinite consciousness, which is looking out through the eyes of every man, woman, and child in this world. You don't believe it. You don't hope it's true. You don't have faith that it's true. You have direct experience that this is so, that you are an illusion, and that ultimately there is only God. So a lot of the practice of magic is very, very entwined and intertangled with the concept of egregores.
And the idea, so egregore is like a collective thought form, and I love that.
Yes. We
have a word for it. And if you think about it, I always talk when I'm teaching about whether it's archangels, or I'm teaching about masters, or even if we're teaching about like interdimensionals, like cosmic beings, like the Pleiadians or anything like that, that really, like names are really just a human concept, because we're so focused, we're so like really even addicted to language. And that's why language is limiting it. Language, even all of the words are really just myths that are pointing to expansive energy beneath it. And so like the name Michael, Archangel Michael, he's not limited to that. He's not limited to the colors we associate with him. He's not limited to, the sword that we know he has, or that he's the direction of south. But that helps us to hook in. Those are the portals through which we can connect our energy to the knowledge of it. And
exactly.
And so you were saying, like, if we invoke, we start, like, maybe we start with Archangel Michael or whoever your HGA is. It's actually Ariel for me, which came to me spontaneously. I didn't know there was an Archangel Ariel, but I was getting into the idea of working with angels. And so I prayed to ask what the name of my guardian angel was. And I heard the name Ariel. And I doubted it at first because I thought that was the name of the Little Mermaid. And then I found out that was actually an angel. Anyway, side note, I just thought I'd share that. But yeah, if you're working with Michael, you're kind of starting, when you're first starting to work, you were saying, like, you kind of are working with your own thought form of that energy. And then at some point you get to the egregore, you connect to the egregore energy. I'm saying it wrong. Can you explain that a little bit better than I just did?
It's kind of hard to describe until you actually perceive it. When you're talking about magic, if you're familiar with the teachings of Rudolf Steiner, he was a guy that started off in theosophy and then eventually branched off and went his own way. But there was an amazing description he gave one time where he was saying, what we're doing with these techniques is we are developing faculties of perception that are dormant within most people. When we're talking about the physical level of reality, we perceive it through our eyes, through our ears, through the sensation of touch, through taste, all of these sorts of things. Well, we have those equivalent faculties on the energetic level of reality, but they are basically, what's the word, atrophied? You know, we've never utilized them, never, you know, forced them to function. So a lot of what we're doing through these practices is forcing those senses to develop so that we're able to perceive these energies. Whenever you do start to be able to perceive this energetic level of reality, one thing you will realize is that the more you do these invocations, the stronger they seem to become. Yeah. You know, in the beginning, like you're doing them at first and you'll think, you know, I'm not really seeing anything here. I'm not detecting anything, but you still get a result. You know, it still seems to work. And you start thinking, well, would it have worked anyway? You know, is it just coincidence? The more you go along, I don't think it's actually becoming stronger. I think you are just becoming more and more able to perceive it. Yeah. And one of the things that you're able to perceive is that every single time you invoke, even if it's just your own energy of like, you know, whatever angel it is you're working with, every single time you do it, you are still forming a little bit stronger connection to that external egregore. And, you know, before I forget, also, if you're familiar with the work of Eckhart Tolle.
Of course, that he was a part of my awakening.
He describes egregores amazingly well in his books, but he does not use that word. He calls them collective egos. Yes. So when you're talking about things, you know, we create egregores, like countries create egregores. Right. Religions create egregores. Races create egregores. Fans of sports teams create egregores. It's basically energy combined of all these different people who are focused on it. So, you know, this is a concept that is pervasive throughout most spiritual traditions. It just has different names to it. And I kind of think the way he describes it in some ways is a lot simpler than...
A little clearer. I remember him in The Power of Now, I think it is. He's talking about... he's talking about the pain body. And so that's basically like an egregore. We have your own thought form, personal pain body. And then he was saying like with a woman in menses that around her cycle, she could be connecting with the collective pain body or the egregore that has to do with womankind and perhaps the pain and suffering that the womankind has been through. But you could also connect to the egregore of the joy and, you know, elation of being, you know, bringing life, you know, bringing children through. So, that collective, or even the collective unconscious, as Jung talks about, the collective consciousness. Another thing is, we even have egregores in sort of superstitious ways, where you have these different experiences where everybody saw, you know, the half man, half hoofed animal that eats babies in the woods. You know, they actually thought they saw this, but it's because of that egregore concept, or the chupacabra or something like that. People are having a collective experience about something.
Yes. And that's also in Tibetan Buddhism. I think they have like an incredibly amazing practice in Tibetan Buddhism for working with and creating thought forms and egregores. You know, for example, one teaching that I came across one time was about how this Lama would get his students together and he would tell them about this horrific demon. Like he would describe it in exquisite detail so that while he's talking about, you know, how horrible it is and what it does and all this sort of thing, he's making them see it like very clearly in their minds. And anything you see clearly in your mind, you're feeding energy to. What's it, that saying they have about where attention goes, energy flows. So they are creating a horrendous thought form, which they will then start to see. They'll start going to the Lama and saying, I saw this demon. I finally saw it. This demon you've been telling me about. And the Lama will say, good, you created it. Now it's your job. The next stage of your practice is you figure out how to get rid of it.
Yeah. That's so great. And you talk about how the demons, which are the thought or egregores that are created, that those are like that's the shadow, even you might say, like that's the inner, that's our inner selves that need to be cleaned up or cared for, nurtured, whatever needs to be ascended. And then we have the external, which some of those internal ones are also positive as well. I'm a hypnotherapist. And so we do work in that subconscious energy where we go in there, we're really trying to release the personal thought forms, which are these we call them known associations that we're created. They were set in probably between the ages of 0 and 8. And it's like, you stay there, you thought form, and make sure nothing else can pass through you unless you, and so getting into that subconscious energy and actually either displacing it, replacing it, or releasing it altogether. It's a scary process though, because if you do release it altogether, you feel lighter and you feel less formed because some of the forms are gone.
You know, going back also to what you were saying a while ago about Jung and even into Freud and his work about the ego, the superego, and the id. When you're talking about the internal work, the internal process that happens while you're working with these things externally, and you're also undergoing this internal process, you know, these concepts and practices go back to a time when people would have had no idea what you were talking about. If you're using words like the id and the superego and the ego, would have meant nothing to them whatsoever. They had to use terminology and concepts that were familiar to them, their cultures, their civilizations, everything else. So when you're talking about on the internal aspect, the internal work, what we're doing is angels and archangels represent our highest possible, our higher selves, the ultimate level to which we are capable of ascending. When you're talking about in magic, they call them goetic entities, or sometimes Christians will refer to them as demons. What you're talking about when you're referring to these things are like the deepest levels of the unconscious and subconscious minds, like that reptilian fight or flight, survive at any cost sort of, you know, part of our mentality that normally in today's society we don't pay a lot of attention to, so it just sort of gets suppressed and smothered down until it explodes in some odd way. What we're doing in magic, we represent the channel between the higher and the lower. You've got angels above, demons below, and us in between. What we're trying to do is, we call magic the union of opposites. We are trying to unite the higher, the lower, and the everyday levels of consciousness into one cohesive unity, which is what Jung would have called self-actualization. When you're that one cohesive unity, that is a huge step towards the completion of the great work.
And that's why I love the way that you taught the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram in High Magick, and you add Sandalphon and Metatron. And I've always done that when I call the sacred directions as well, because that is the vertical plane as well, is kind of what you're describing. We have the horizontal plane and the vertical plane. And I find that to be very complete. Besides, I have a thing with Sandalphon. I love them.
When I started doing that, it was one of those things where I thought, well, you know, when you start doing the practice, you're working with the four major archangels of the Western world. And you've got them in all four directions. And part of the point of doing this ritual is not only are you cleansing all the energy out of the space where you're doing it, you know, it's kind of like smudging or saging or you know, any other way that you would cleanse an area. That's part of what you're doing, where you're pushing all the energy out of that space and creating a sort of vacuum so that there will be no energy in that space which will interact with the magic that you're about to do. You want it to be purely of your own design, what you're about to do. So I always thought, well, that sounds great and all, but it's like I've got these four angels around me, but it's like I'm wide open above, and why? Like if something was really trying to get in, why wouldn't it just come from above or you know, come from below? And so I added those two angels just because, you know, psychologically to me it felt better to be encased so that I'm sort of blocked and shielded and protected from all angles. But whenever I did that, you know, just adding those other two, it seemed to make it so much more powerful and tangible that it made me start wanting to add even more and even more. And I didn't even realize at the time that is a huge part of doing magic. It's like when you're learning those first order rituals, you're learning like a formula that you'll then expand upon, you know, until not only are you invoking these four angels, but you're invoking the 72 angels and the angels of the deacons of the zodiac and all that around you at the same time. So it kind of took me through that process of, you know, trial and error just because of what felt right. And it goes back to what you said or asked earlier about the initiation. You know, no one told me to do that in the beginning. It was just like I was sort of led to it through, you know, my own thought processes and through trial and error.
I could keep you all day, and I feel like I need to not do that. I don't even know how long we've been talking. So one last question, and reminding everyone to check the links below. By the way, I want to say, so far as thought forms are concerned, I will link in this description past episodes where I talked about thought forms. And we will also link Damien's upcoming, I'll link High Magick as well as Angels and Archangels, a Magician's Guide, and that should be we are actually recording this one day. I think it's actually coming out tomorrow on our calendar, right? Yeah. So when y'all hear this, it's out, and so just go. But I also want to just ask you. Very simple question. How can magic help us today? Especially I'm thinking about this planet, all the crap that's going on, all the pain and the suffering. And so how can magic help us individually and then collectively?
Well, I think in many, many different ways. Just one example is, even if you're not doing magic for manifestation purposes, even if you're just invoking these angels because you enjoy the sensation of the interaction with them, and you see how much it improves your outlook on life and even your physical energy, and it makes you the only way I know how to describe it is it lifts you up. When you start, like when I started doing this work, from that point on, rarely did I ever experience things anymore like depression or despair or any of that. It was like it just automatically boosted my energy. It made me feel better emotionally, psychologically, physically, in every way. So when you feel better, when you're improving yourself, when you're doing, in what they call New Age circles, like raising your vibrational frequency, you are going to change the vibrational frequency of every other person, place, and thing that you come in contact with. You are going to turn yourself into a living talisman so that you don't have to try to go out and save the world. Wherever you go, you are going to automatically have an uplifting, upraising effect on everything and person that you come in contact with. So that's a huge part of how magic can help us. But then you also have the aspect of it really does allow you to participate in the unfolding creation of the physical world. So you can do magic to, I'll do magic all the time. I live, in New York and Harlem. So I will do magic every day. Like I will start off doing it. Like I will bring in as much energy as I can and say, let this protect, guide, and illuminate everyone in my apartment building. And then I'll do it the next day and I'll bring it down and I'll say, let this protect, guide, and illuminate everyone on my block. And then the next day I say, let it do it for everyone in Harlem. And then the next day I say, let it do it for everyone in New York. So you're literally doing magic for the intention of raising everyone's vibration so that we are all closer to the completion of the great work.
Have nothing to add to that. That's beautiful. Amen. You're anchoring that energy and you're shining that light. Well, again, I could have you on for hours. So I just will say, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. Thank you for your books. Thank you for the videos. And check out also pretty soon, the Sounds True course will be out. So y'all keep an eye out for that. And you know what? We'll keep in touch and I'll make sure that I give it a shout out so people can go find it because I think that's going to be powerful.
I would absolutely love that. To me, it's like these are the only kind of conversations that matter. Amen. Everything else is just stuff you get through in order to get back to this. So, not only do I appreciate you having me on just for, getting the word out about magic and about the books and things like that, but also just because it makes me enjoy life more. Thank you for that.
Well, definitely check out the links in the description. We have all of Damien's information. We have the links to High Magick as well as Angels and Archangels. And I also just wanted to let you know, we just brushed through it a little bit, but the story of Damien's wrongful murder conviction has been the subject of the HBO documentary called Paradise Lost and West of Memphis. I hope you loved this episode as much as I did. And I look forward, if you want to put some comments here, talk to me about your experience with magic. And actually, I would love to invite you to like, subscribe, share, comment, And leave a review for the podcast if you're listening. And if you do subscribe on the YouTube channel, be sure to hit the little bell because then you'll get notifications of the new podcasts. I am currently doing them once per week. And when I get a little more free time, I publish a lot more. I publish some in between the weekly podcast. And as always, thanks for tuning in. I love you, whoever you are.